The day God said to begin again. When grace breathes life into what died. There are moments in life when everything feels like it has reached its end. When the light fades, the laughter disappears, and even prayers seem to echo back from empty skies. You look around and realize that something inside you has quietly died. A dream, a love, a purpose, maybe even your faith. You stand among the ruins of what once was, and all that remains is silence. The kind of silence that feels too heavy to breathe in, too endless to escape. It is there in that sacred stillness that the voice of God often whispers the most unexpected words, begin again. At first, it sounds impossible. How do you begin again when everything you've built has crumbled? How do you hope again when your heart has forgotten what hope feels like? Yet grace is not a logical thing. It is a divine mystery that moves through ashes and breathes life into what no longer beats. When we think the story is over, heaven picks up the pen. When we think the tomb has sealed our fate, God rolls away the stone. The valleys of silence and sorrow are not where God leaves us. They are where He meets us. He walks through the barren places we've abandoned and whispers life back into the bones we thought would never move again. Like Ezekiel standing before the valley of dry bones, we too are asked the question, can these bones live? And in our trembling uncertainty, grace answers, yes. Because even in death, there is a rhythm of resurrection waiting to be sung. Maybe you've been standing in your own valley, where faith feels fragile and time feels wasted. Maybe you've buried things that once carried light, a calling, a friendship, a prayer that never found its answer. But today, God leans close to the fragments of your heart and says, it's not over. The story is not done. The same breath that spoke galaxies into being still hovers over the dust of your soul, ready to breathe again. Grace doesn't deny the death. It redeems it. It doesn't erase the pain. It transforms it into soil, where new beginnings grow. The day God says, begin again, is not a command to forget, but an invitation to trust. Trust that even what has died can live again, that even the broken places can bloom, that even in your silence, His promise still stands. Because grace is not afraid of what has ended. It is born for moments like these. And so, as dawn slowly rises over the ashes of yesterday, heaven whispers once more, breathe, stand up. The story isn't over, it's just beginning. Part 1. When life dies. The silence before resurrection. There are days when the soul feels like it's wandering through a silent desert, where every prayer dissolves into the air, where hope feels like dust slipping through your fingers. The things that once made you alive, your passion, your calling, your joy, now lie motionless like ashes after a storm. You feel as if the breath of life itself has left you, and all that remains is a hollow emptiness that even tears cannot fill. It's in that quiet, aching space that faith begins to tremble, and you find yourself whispering, God, where are you in all of this? Yet sometimes, God is not gone. He's just silent, not absent, but working in the stillness, shaping something sacred beneath the surface of your pain. There are deaths that never make it to a graveyard. The death of a dream that didn't come true, the death of promises that broke, the death of love that faded, the death of courage that ran dry. Everything that once felt alive now exists only as a memory, faint and fragile. You watch yourself drift away from who you used to be, unable to go back, unsure how to move forward. And yet, right there, in that very place where everything seems finished, God is quietly preparing a new beginning. The scriptures tell of Ezekiel standing before a valley of dry bones. God asked him, Son of man, can these bones live? That question wasn't just for Ezekiel. It's for us too. When we stand before the lifeless places in our own hearts, we look at the shattered pieces of our story, the unanswered prayers, the wasted years, the moments we can't fix, and we ask, can this live again? Our human answer is always no, but God's answer has never changed. Yes, because He is the God who steps into what has died. He doesn't shy away from our darkness. He isn't repelled by our despair. He walks straight into the tomb, into the silence, and begins to breathe again. Like Lazarus, we think it's too late. 4 days gone, 4 months gone, 4 years gone, but time means nothing to the one who holds eternity. God doesn't rush like we do. He arrives exactly when the world has given up, to show that resurrection doesn't come from human strength. It comes from Him alone. When life feels dead, when faith feels numb, when nothing seems to move, that's often when God is doing His deepest work. In the darkness, He strips away the illusions that we could sustain ourselves, that our power was enough. He lets certain things die, not to punish us, but to make space for something pure, something eternal. When the morning comes, what remains is no longer built on human striving, but on divine grace. God doesn't pull us out of the winter too quickly. He leaves us there long enough for the roots of our faith to dig deep, so that when spring comes, life rises from the very ground where we once fell. Maybe that's where you are right now, in the long winter of your soul. Maybe your prayers feel unanswered, your heart feels heavy, your world feels still. You see nothing but darkness, and it feels like the end. But remember this: a seed never grows in the light. It breaks open in the dark. Beneath the soil, hidden, unseen, life begins to form. The same is true for you. What looks like silence is not abandonment. It's preparation. God is sowing something in you that will one day rise, something stronger than what died. Sometimes resurrection begins not by escaping death, but by surrendering to it. The seed must first fall and die before new life can emerge. So too must our pride, our control, our fear. Grace cannot enter what we keep clenched in our fists. It flows into what is surrendered, what is broken, what is still. In our stillness, His voice grows clearer. In our helplessness, His power shines brighter. God never asked us to be unbreakable. He asked us to be available, to stand before Him, even in the ruins, and say, "Lord, I don't know how, but I'm here." Because every resurrection begins with a silence like this. Every miracle starts in a tomb, in the place where human hands can do nothing more. When we fall silent, God speaks. When we reach the end of our strength, He breathes life. When we think every door is closed, He builds a new one out of what we thought was debris. The silence before resurrection is not an ending. It's a pause before the music of life begins again. For it is in the deepest darkness that God writes the most radiant chapters. And when His appointed time comes, His voice will break through the stillness and call your name, saying, "Come forth." So if today you find yourself standing in a valley of dry bones, don't be afraid. This is not the place where God leaves you. It's the place where He will find you. Somewhere in the silence, something holy is already stirring. Something that once died is being rewritten by grace. Something that once was buried is about to rise. And when the moment comes, you will hear Him say with love and power beyond all measure, "Begin again." Part 2. When grace enters the grave. There's something mysterious about grace. It never avoids the places that smell like death. It doesn't flinch at darkness. And it isn't afraid of hopelessness. Grace walks straight into the very graves we've sealed shut. The ones where we've buried our pain, our failures, our regrets, and the parts of ourselves we can't bear to face again. While the world turns away and calls it the end, God steps closer, places His hand on the stone, and whispers, "I'm still here." When Lazarus had been dead 4 days, everyone believed it was over. The tomb was sealed, the air heavy with sorrow, and the sound of weeping filled the air. Hope had expired, but Jesus still came. Not in a rush, not in panic, but with the calm authority of the one who knows that life still waits behind the stone. He didn't avoid the tomb. He entered its shadow. He didn't recoil at the smell of decay, because He is the breath of life itself. And when He stood before that grave, silence became sacred, because death was about to surrender. That is how grace works. Quietly, tenderly, yet with unstoppable power. It doesn't need sunlight to shine. It finds the darkest corners and begins to kindle light there. When grace enters, the chains of regret start to crack. The tombs of shame begin to tremble, and the heavy stones of guilt slowly roll away. Grace doesn't ask, "Why did you fail?" It simply says, "Let me touch that place." Maybe you carry a grave of your own. Maybe it's where you've buried your faith. A love that was lost, a dream that never came true, or a memory you can't forgive yourself for. You've shut the door, convinced no one could love what's inside, but grace is standing right outside, knocking softly. It doesn't demand your strength. It doesn't ask you to clean the mess. It just whispers, "Let me in," because grace doesn't come to condemn. It comes to resurrect. Remember the woman caught in adultery? The crowd gathered with stones in their hands, ready to destroy her, but Jesus stooped down, writing in the dust. And when he looked up, he said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, they dropped their stones and walked away. Then there were only two left: guilt and grace, shame and mercy. And in that moment, the dead thing inside her began to live again. It wasn't her innocence that saved her. It was his compassion. Grace doesn't simply repair what's broken. It transforms it into something more beautiful than before. It doesn't erase the scars. It fills them with gold. Like a Japanese artisan practicing kintsugi, God uses grace as his gold dust, mending our cracks not to hide them but to make them shine, so that when his light touches us, the very places where we once broke become the most radiant parts of our story. And when grace enters the grave, it doesn't just call what's dead to live. It calls you to come out. "Lazarus, come forth." That voice was not only for a man who had died. It's for every soul trapped in fear, sin, and despair. God calls you by name because he knows exactly where you've been buried. Every heart has its tomb, and every tomb has a heavenly voice waiting to be heard. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't believing that God can perform miracles. It's believing he would perform one for you. We easily believe that he loves others, forgives others, redeems others. But when it comes to ourselves, we hesitate. Yet grace doesn't play favorite. It pursues every story, every scar, every soul, and whispers, "You are worthy of resurrection too." When grace enters your grave, it doesn't rush you to the surface. It patiently unwraps the grave clothes, layer by layer, of fear, guilt, shame, and bitterness. It peels away the layers of the past you've wrapped around your heart until you can finally breathe again. The first breath of freedom, not from reality, but within it. Grace doesn't make you forget what happened. It changes what it means. Grace doesn't come to erase death. It comes to prove that death no longer wins. It turns tombs into testimonies, tears into songs, and ashes into gardens. When Jesus steps into your death, he doesn't just say, "Live." He says, "I'll be with you." And that presence, steady, gentle, unshakable, becomes the air that fills your lungs again. So if you find yourself in a season of graves, where it feels like God is silent, where your strength is gone, and your prayers have turned to whispers, know this: he's coming. He's not bringing judgment. He's bringing light. He's not asking, "Why did you die?" He's saying, "I love you still." And when grace truly enters, something indescribable happens. You begin to feel warmth where there was only cold. You sense a stirring where there was only stillness. And slowly the heartbeat of hope begins again. You realize that the end wasn't the end. It was the soil for your resurrection. The grave was never meant to hold you. It was meant to reveal the one who can bring you out. And when he does, you'll hear him speak through the tears and the light, through the cracks and the quiet, with a voice so full of love that it makes the impossible possible. "Rise, my child. Live again. I entered your grave so that you could walk out with me." Part 3. When God speaks, the word that revives. There are moments in life when it feels like God has been silent for far too long. No voice, no sign, no warmth left in prayer, only an endless quiet where every cry seems to echo back from the void. You begin to wonder if heaven has forgotten your name. But then, somewhere in the stillness, something begins to stir. A whisper, soft as a breath, cutting through the silence, the voice of God. It doesn't come with thunder or earthquakes. It doesn't shout or demand. It comes like a gentle wind sweeping through the desert of your soul. One word, one breath, one command: live again. And suddenly, what was dead begins to move. From the very beginning of creation, life itself began with a word, "Let there be light," and there was light. That first divine utterance didn't just illuminate the universe. It gave birth to it. Even now, the same word continues to create, to call, to breathe. Every time God speaks, something within us awakens. His word doesn't just instruct, it ignites. It doesn't just inform, it transforms. It is not mere language. It is the breath of life, the heartbeat of heaven, pulsing through human hearts. Ezekiel once stood in a valley, filled with dry bones, a landscape of death, silence, and hopelessness. God asked him, "Son of man, can these bones live?" The question seemed impossible, but when Ezekiel spoke as commanded, the wind began to blow. Bones rattled, flesh returned, and breath entered once more, and a great army stood up from the dust. The same happens when God speaks into the wasteland of our souls. His word reaches into the impossible, into what has been forgotten or buried, and calls it back to life. Grace often comes to us not through miracles of sight, but through the power of a word. One "fear not" can silence a lifetime of anxiety. One "be still" can calm the storm within. One "rise" can lift a heart that thought it would never stand again. When God speaks, He doesn't just command life, He creates it. His words carry the power to restore what our strength could never repair. But to hear Him, we must learn the art of silence. God's voice doesn't compete with the noise of the world. It's not in the thunder, the fire, or the earthquake. Elijah discovered the truth when he stood on the mountain. The Lord was not in the chaos, but in a still, small voice. It takes quiet to hear it. The kind of quiet that comes when you stop striving, stop controlling, and simply listen. And when you do, you'll find that even a whisper from God carries more power than all the noise of the earth. Sometimes He speaks through Scripture, words you've read 100 times that suddenly blaze like lightning through the darkness. Sometimes He speaks through a prayer, whispered through tears, or through a person who shows up right when you thought no one would. However He chooses to speak, the effect is always the same. Darkness trembles, and the heart begins to breathe again. There are words from God that both comfort and confront, words that call us out of the tomb of safety. "Come forth," He says, and the walls we built around our fear begin to crack. But when God calls you out, He doesn't stand far away commanding from a distance. He stands right at the entrance of your tomb, with outstretched hands and light spilling from His presence, saying, "Walk with me." His word doesn't echo from heaven. It resounds in your chest, woven into your very heartbeat. God's voice carries a kind of power no other sound can imitate. It travels through walls of fear, through the weight of shame, through the years of silence. It doesn't scold or condemn, it invites. Every divine word is an invitation to live, to trust, to come into the light. When God speaks, the universe listens, and even death itself must obey. Maybe today you're longing to hear that voice again. Maybe you've been praying for so long that your words have turned into sighs. You wonder if heaven still remembers you. But hear this: God is still speaking, not always through thunder or spectacle, but in the gentle rhythm of your own heart. His voice has not faded. It still carries the same love, the same power, the same authority that raised the dead and stilled the sea. Listen closely. You might hear Him whisper even now, "My child, live." And when that word reaches you, everything changes. Where there was barrenness, new life begins to bloom. Where there was pain, peace takes root. Where there was only a valley of dry bones, an army of faith begins to rise. For the word of God never loses its power. It is still breathing, still calling, still reviving what the world calls dead. That's the same voice that spoke light into existence, the same voice that called Lazarus from the grave, and the same voice that is whispering in your spirit right now. A voice that never grows silent, only waiting for your heart to listen. Because sometimes, all it takes is one word from God, just one, and everything that has died within you will live again. Part 4. When God rebuilds, grace that restores ruins. After what has died comes back to life. God doesn't simply leave us standing outside the tomb. He begins to rebuild, and that might be one of the most beautiful and sacred journeys of faith. The journey of restoration, where grace not only saves but transforms. Because when God redeems you, He doesn't just bring you out of the grave. He builds your soul into something entirely new. There are moments when you look back at the ruins of your life and wonder, can anything good ever come from this? Dreams shattered, trust broken, years lost, all lying there like a city collapsed after a storm. But then, in the middle of that devastation, grace appears, quiet, gentle, like the first drop of rain falling on barren soil. It doesn't come to cover the cracks but to plant new life in them. Scripture tells us that Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem and found the city walls broken, its gates burned, its people scattered. But instead of despairing, he knelt down and prayed, and God gave him strength to rebuild, stone by stone. It didn't happen overnight. It took courage, tears, and faith. The same is true when God rebuilds our souls. He doesn't do it with a single miracle, but through a process of grace, slow, steady, and deeply personal. God doesn't just patch up what's broken. He creates from within. He doesn't restore us to what we used to be, because what we used to be has already died. He makes us new, stronger, deeper, and more radiant with His love. Like a potter gathering the shards of a shattered vessel, His hands reshape us, filling every crack with light. And when the sunlight touches those repaired places, they shine the brightest, because that's where the story of redemption lives. Sometimes rebuilding hurts, because to rebuild, God must first tear down what was built on false foundations, habits that enslave us, lies we believed about ourselves, and attachments that kept us from Him. It feels like losing even more, but in truth, it's purification. For often, what God has to destroy is not who we are, but who we've become without Him, so He can restore the person He designed us to be all along. When we are weak, He builds with His strength. When we doubt, He builds with patience. When we despair, He builds with hope. And little by little, He transforms ruins into foundations for something new. As Paul wrote, "If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, all things have become new." God's grace doesn't just restore what was lost. It transforms everything it touches. Think of Peter, the man who denied Jesus 3 times, broken and ashamed. After the resurrection, Jesus didn't just forgive him. He called him back. "Feed my sheep." Peter's failure wasn't the end. It became the foundation for his calling. That's the wonder of grace. It doesn't erase our shame. It redeems it. It turns the wound into a witness, the pain into purpose, the failure into fuel for something eternal. When God rebuilds, He's not just restoring a person. He's rewriting a story. The story is no longer about what broke you, but about how He rebuilt you. It's no longer about loss, but about how He made new life grow in the ashes. Every place that once made you fall becomes the ground where your faith stands stronger. Because in ruins, grace finds soil deep enough to take root. Rebuilding takes time, but each day God lays another invisible brick within you. You may not see it, but He's working. In your tears, in your silent prayers, in your small steps through the storm. He's crafting something holy out of what you thought was beyond repair. And one day, when you look back, you'll realize the very place you once broke has become the place where He performed His greatest miracle. For grace is not just forgiveness. It is the power of recreation. It teaches you to believe again, to love again, to live again. And when God completes His work in you, those who saw your ruins will stand in awe and say, "Surely, this was the hand of God." The wall that once crumbled becomes a temple of peace. The wound that once bled becomes a source of healing, and the story that once ended in ashes becomes a song of resurrection. Because this is what grace does. It rebuilds what the world abandoned and makes it more beautiful than before. So if today you look at your life and see only ruins, know this: God has already begun His work. Even if you can't see it, He's building. Even if you're still hurting, He's healing. Even if you've lost everything, He's laying the foundation for something greater, because with him, nothing is ever truly lost. It's only being prepared to live again, stronger, brighter, and holier. When God rebuilds your life, he doesn't just give you back what was taken. He gives you a new life entirely, where every scar becomes a testament of his power and mercy. And when his work is done, you'll realize grace didn't just bring you out of the grave. It turned you into a living testimony that with God even the ruins can bloom. Part 5. When you walk again, the journey of renewal. When God calls you out of the darkness, when his grace breathes life into what once was dead, the story doesn't end at the entrance of the tomb. It begins there. To be alive again is not merely to open your eyes to the light. It is to learn how to walk in that light, step by step, with a renewed heart and a faith reborn through grace. Because resurrection is not a single moment, it is a journey, a sacred, unfolding journey, where your faith matures with every breath you take. When Lazarus walked out of the grave, he was still wrapped in his burial cloth, and Jesus said, "Unbind him and let him go." That image carries a divine truth. Even after resurrection, we must learn to be freed from what once bound us. Death may be behind us, but its shadows often linger. In our memories, our fears, our habits from the past. God doesn't just bring us back to life. He teaches us to live free. Every step after resurrection is a reminder that we walk not by our own strength, but by grace. Some days you will stride with confidence, and other days you will limp, carrying wounds that still ache. But God never rushes you. He walks beside you, matching your pace, waiting patiently for you to heal. For to him, the journey matters more than the destination. He isn't looking for perfection in your steps. He's looking for faithfulness in your heart. To walk again is to see the world through new eyes. Eyes that have seen the dark and now cherish the light. It's to love with a heart that has been broken, so you finally understand that true love is born not of emotion, but of forgiveness. It's to trust again after disappointment, because now your trust is no longer built on understanding. It's built on the one who held your hand when you couldn't stand. God doesn't call you out of the grave just to survive. He calls you to walk with purpose. He wants every breath, every word, every step you take to declare that life in him cannot be extinguished. Like Peter, the man who once denied him in fear, yet later preached with fire that no one could silence. The one who fell deepest became the one who stood strongest, because he knew what it meant to be raised by grace. When God lets you walk again, he never promises an easy road. You will walk through places where you once fell. Memories will try to pull you back into the grave. But if you keep walking, if you let grace be the air in your lungs, each step becomes a hymn of resurrection. And one day, you'll realize that the very roads that wounded you have made you stronger, and the scars you carry have taught you how to love more deeply. Walking with God means learning to move slowly in his presence. It's not about running toward the future in haste, but about pausing long enough to listen for his voice in the quiet. It's about waking up each morning and whispering thanks, because every breath, every single one, is proof that a miracle is still unfolding. It's about learning to forgive, to smile at the past, and to keep your heart open for the new thing God is doing right now. There will be times when this journey of renewal leads you into new storms, but unlike before, you won't be afraid, because you know now. The one who brought you out of the grave will never leave you in the wilderness. When you stumble, he carries you. When you fall, he kneels beside you, places his scarred hand on your shoulder, and says, "Get up, my child. I'm still here." And so you keep walking, not alone, but hand in hand with the one who conquered death for you. The journey after resurrection is also a journey of service. When God restores you, he doesn't intend for you to keep that new life to yourself. He wants you to become a vessel of healing for others. The pain you endured becomes the compassion you now offer. Your scars become safe places where others can find comfort. For a soul that has died and come back to life, he is a soul that knows how to understand pain. And in the hands of grace, what once was weakness becomes a tool of divine strength. And then, someday, after valleys and mountaintops, after storms and dawns, you will look back and realize that this journey of resurrection was never just about returning to life. It was about returning to Him. Every step has drawn you closer to the heart of the one who loved you with a cross-shaped love. Every breath has been a quiet song rising to heaven. Not perfect, but true. And when the evening light of your days begins to fade, you'll be able to smile and say, I have finished the race. Not because you were strong, but because His grace sustained you. Not because you never fell, but because every time you did, He lifted you up. Not because you were always faithful, but because He never stopped being faithful. So when God calls you to walk again, don't be afraid. Don't look back at the tomb. Look toward the sunrise, because your journey isn't over. Every tear, every scar, every moment of weakness, all of it is just the opening chapter of a greater story. And as you walk with Him, you'll come to see that being resurrected is not just a miracle, it's a new life unfolding. One step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time, guided by the hands of the one who brought you back to life with everlasting love. Conclusion: the new beginning. When God says, begin again. Every journey has an ending, but in God, every ending is the beginning of something new. When He says begin again, it isn't just an invitation to move forward. It's a declaration of grace, that what has died can live again, what was lost can be found, and what was broken can be made more beautiful than before. This entire journey, from the valley of dry bones to the open tomb, from the breath of life to the rebuilding of ruins, to walking again in the light, is the story of every soul that has fallen shattered and believed it was over. But then God comes, not with thunder, not with haste, but with a whisper, soft and full of mercy. My child, begin again. And in that moment, the darkness fades, and the dawn rises once more. When we look back on the road we've walked, we begin to see that every wound, every tear, every fall had a purpose. They were the seeds God planted in the soil of our hearts. And when His grace touched them, they bloomed into flowers of renewal. No pain is ever wasted in His hands. He uses even the ruins to rebuild something far more radiant than what once was. God never promised that the path ahead would be smooth, but He did promise this, that He would walk it with us. When we are weak, He becomes our strength. When we doubt, His voice gently speaks again. When we grow weary, His breath revives us. Because the grace of God is not a single act of rescue. It is a living current of love, flowing endlessly through our days, healing, shaping, and restoring the soul that dares to surrender. When we let Him in, He doesn't just continue our story, He rewrites it with light. The chapters that once dripped with sorrow become testimonies of redemption. The nights that once seemed endless become the canvas where grace shines brightest. And finally, we understand, God never wanted us just to survive. He wanted us to live in Him. Like the sunrise after a storm, like a flower that blooms after the frost. Grace renews all things. And when God says, begin again, it isn't a command. It's a promise whispered with tenderness, that life still awaits, that hope is still alive, and that He is still here, holding your hand, smiling, saying softly, you've made it through the night. Walk forward now, for I am making all things new. And so in that light we walk, no longer burdened by fear, no longer looking back at what has died, but filled with gratitude. Because now we know, more deeply than ever before, that every ending in God is truly the beginning of new life. And as the wind stirs and the morning breeze again, we hear it, gentle, steady, unmistakable. The same voice that spoke to the tomb, that calls to our hearts, even now. Begin again.